Hey, friends, I thought I'd bring you a Squint podcast on a passage of scripture that is quite relevant today and maybe difficult for some to understand. Romans 13, 1 through 7. And it's the age old question. It brings up the age old question of what is the responsibility of Christians, believers, and government? Is there a place for civil disobedience? That's an age-old question. I have been asked that for years. Um, I teach at the Potter's House. I teach Bible and economics. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for the past 26 years. and one of our teachers, Mrs. Cisco, in her civics class, every year has students um, interview pastors and other Christians. Sorry about that. Other Christian leaders uh, on the question about what is a Christian's responsibility to the government. And so I get asked this all the time, and Romans 13 is the hot passage, always. And so I thought tonight what I'd do, this is May 15th, what I would do is I would just we'd look at the passage and work through some questions. Let's take a look at the passage. I'm sharing my screen with you, so let's take a look at the passage. Now, it says in Romans 13, I'm just going to read part of it. You can read most of it. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except for that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Okay? So we get that. We understand that. You look down to verse 5. Therefore, key verse, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. So, uh, so there it is. There's the passage of scripture. Now, I was reading a friend, a relative of mine, uh, my cousin Lonnie Rodriguez. He is my first cousin once removed, genealogically speaking, and he posted on his Facebook post a quote from a man by the name of Mario Murillo of Mario Murillo Ministries. And this gentleman, Mario, someone had talked to him and responded to a statement that he had made. Mario had said that there's no verse in the Bible that tells you to obey evil government or laws. And someone they misunderstood what he was saying, thinking that he was saying there's no place in the Bible where it talks that you should obey government. So then the person mentioned Romans 13, 1 through 7. And the person mentioned that they said this, out of curiosity, how do you justify your argument against obeying the government when you read Romans 13, 1 through 7? The government Paul was talking about was even more oppressive than we can even imagine. You could truly be martyred for your faith under the Roman government. And what was Paul's response? He didn't call for government reform. He didn't call us to protest the government. He didn't demand his rights and call on the government to recognize his rights. None of the above. And he said in the face of a brutal government that we should obey government. He didn't say obey if your rights are recognized or not. And then he says the church of today has to realize that the government is not our arena as Christians. We have no place in government. Not our arena. Never in the history of the church has God used the government to bring about change. Okay? That was a friend of his. Now Mr. Murillo gives several reasons why he disagrees with that. All right? And I was going to write something up because I had somebody post on my Facebook page about Romans 13, 1 through 7. How can you, Pastor Clint, how can you say that we need to retaliate when Romans 13, 1 through 7 says we should obey? And I was going to write something up, but I thought these answers were good, so I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. Here we go. Um, First of all, what we're talking about here is evil government. You might say, but Romans 13, 1 through 7 doesn't talk about whether the government's evil. The government in Paul's day was evil. Okay? Here's the counter argument to that. Mr. Murillo says, in replying to this person, like the person told him, you could be martyred for your faith under the Roman government. Mr. Murillo says, let's see, they're martyred, right? That means they're not obeying the law, okay? They never would have been martyred had they not broken the law. Okay, so the first thing that Mr. Murillo says is people were martyred for their faith. They did oppose government. They did disobey. And these were godly people. All right? That was the first one. Then the protester, the guy letting Mr. Murillo know that you need to obey government regardless, says that Paul did not, call for government reform. He didn't say we should protest the government, none of the above. But the truth is, Mr. Murillo says in point number 2, is that Paul did all of that. Certainly, Paul protested government. There's a passage in the book of Acts. It's Acts chapter 16. And Paul is in the city of Philippi. And him and Silas were thrown in jail for preaching the gospel. Excuse me. And they were beaten. And Paul was a Roman citizen. And when they found out, when the authorities found out that they had beaten a Roman citizen, which you're not supposed to do, they tried to come in and settle the deal quietly so no one knew, called cover up. And Paul said, no, no, no. Paul says in Acts 16:37, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now, do they put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come themselves and get us out. Paul was letting them know, you're not going to do this thing. You have violated this. You have violated our rights as people, as citizens, and you are not going to get away with this. You're going to let everybody know that you did wrong. So there was a point where Paul did protest. Paul did stand up for his rights. Paul did make government accountable. All right? And then the third thing, he calls it Mario, calls it the zinger, is when this friend of his said that the church of today has to realize that government's not the arena for Christians. Never in the history of the church has God used government to bring about change. I mean, that's just, that right there is just foolish. Now, Mr. Murillo wisely points out to his friend, have you not heard of William Wilberforce, who was a Christian who used his faith in Jesus to abolish slavery in England? In fact, he says, believers throughout history have created child labor laws, health regulations, and have exposed injustice and corruption. It's safe to say that Christians are more responsible for influencing government and bringing about reform by forcing the laws to be changed and standing up for justice than any other group in history. Now, if you just look at our country, my goodness, I want to share with you the Declaration of Independence. We broke away from England, and what we did was considered treason. Why, we should have obeyed government. But not the case. And our founding fathers, though not all were Christians, many were. And they looked at the Bible and formed our Constitution, much of it from the Bible, and that's why I believe that our republic has lasted for 250 some odd years, or almost 250 years. But here is from the Declaration of Independence, and it says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God, referring to God, entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. And then here's the biggie. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, freedom of choice, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay? So government we don't get our rights from government, we get our rights from God. And governments to protect those rights. Governments are instituted among men, deriving or getting their just powers from the consent of the governed. Government gets its powers from us, the people. It's not the other way around. We've got it all backwards here these days with these governors shutting down states. They're not listening to their people. They're not listening to those whom they govern. They derive their powers from the consent of the governed. But what if the governed no longer consent? And that is the point. And so, back to the well, I guess I didn't present my screen to you. I'm so sorry. I thought I was showing you scripture and my screen, but apparently I didn't do that. I apologize. I'm going to keep going though. So I guess how I want to go on with this and kind of bring this down now and close this out is while our states have not listened to those who are the governed, whom they get their powers from. So back to the article then. All right. So Mr. Mueller or Murillo, I'm sorry, Mr. Murillo, he says, okay, so he goes back to Romans 13, 1 through 7, and he seems to be saying this, that yes, we should honor government, but are we to honor government in every form? And he says, no, we shouldn't. To demonstrate, and so he says, he gives three things that we need to look out for if government is not doing the things that God has put government in place to do. He says you got to be aware. And so here's three things. One, according to Romans 13, 1 through 7, government is not to be a terror of good works. Any government that terrorizes the innocent is not of God. And he says, how can you say Hitler was God's will for Germany? Hitler and other tyrants are in fact the ones being warned that they were God appointed government who would destroy them. All right. So that's why the just powers of the world rose up and destroyed the Nazis. They were not going to follow Hitler. He was abusing human rights. He was killing people, murdering people. Nobody had any choice. Nobody had any freedom. And that's why the people rose up. All right. So any government that terrorizes the innocent is not of God. Now let's look at the second one. The second thing that he closes out with is that we need to be aware of about governments is governments that God ordains, they praise good work. Authorities that are endorsed by God do not hate or oppose Christian activity. In fact, they are the ones, even if they are not Christian themselves, and most of our governments are not Christian themselves, they do not insult evangelism, winning people for Christ, nor the work of God or the work of the church. The policemen, the teachers, the politicians, they're glad to see when kids get out of gangs or get off from drugs because of the presence of the church and the ministry of the gospel. So legitimate government praises good works. And the third thing he says is, you just don't observe. I'm fumbling my page here. He says, you are not to be subject just for the sake of conscience. I'm gonna quote this. This is Mr. Murillo of Murillo Ministries. He says, when it becomes tricky, it is when government is a mixture of right and wrong. Jesus said of the Pharisees, therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, but do not do. So do what they say, but don't partake in the hypocrisy. Watch them for the moment when they cross the line and come between you and your God. And just as your conscience should drive us to obey the laws, we should also know when conscience tells us not to obey the laws. All right? So obey government, but when they violate the laws, the rights of people, those inalienable rights, all right? When they tell us to violate our faith, no longer follow them. That's what the Bible is saying. You know, Peter said, we cannot speak the things, whatever he said in Acts chapter 4, verses 18 through 20, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. They are not going to violate following God. Peter said it again very simply in Acts chapter 5 when he said we ought to obey God rather than men. See, God not only does not endorse evil government, he will have no part in it. Psalm 94:20 says this: can a corrupt throne be allied with you? A throne that brings on misery by its decrees? The wicked band together against the righteous and condemn the innocent to death. See, a corrupt government cannot be allied with God. And I want to give you one last quote as I close this out tonight. In fact, this is a quote from Matthew Henry. Evil laws are the worst form of sin. They provide legitimacy to evil. Iniquity, sin, is daring enough even when human laws are against it, which often prove too weak to give an effectual check to it. But how insolent, how mischievous is when it's backed up by law. Sin is not the better, but much the worse for being enacted by law. Nor will it excuse those that practice it to say that they did not do, but much more the worse for being enacted by law. Nor will it excuse those that practice it to say that they did, but do as they were bidden. Notice how at the end Matthew Henry says we can't use the excuse that we were just obeying the law. That is why Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak to us, not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian theologian and pastor during World War II in Nazi Germany. While many churches were looking the other way, while Hitler suppressed human rights and murdered people, Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood for his faith. He suffered, but he stood for his faith. I'm going to just read what Mr. Murillo closes his paper with by saying, the laws being created by Democrats using the coronavirus as an excuse. And far worse than the virus itself, because unlike the virus, those new laws become permanent. It's time for the church to wake up and take action, beginning with voting the evildoers out of office and quit calling our submission a godly thing when Mr. Mueller said it's a cowardly thing. He closes with Psalm 94:16. Who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity? Well, I want to add my 4 cents to it. I know, 2 cents. I double it. When government violates the basic rights that we are created with, liberty, free choice, pursuing our happiness, ownership, property, then we are to disobey. Actually, I like to say it this way: call government out on the carpet and correct them. Because they're the disobedient ones, not us. All right? There's a rule of law. Secondly, civil disobedience. Protests. How do we disobey civilly? Well, protest, voting, contacting our congressmen, and letting them know, and probably in some extreme cases, just taking a stand, and maybe even physically defending ourselves, if that's the case, if we have to, if we're being attacked physically, if we're being withheld and restrained. Now, for civil disobedience, we also must be willing to suffer consequences. Go to jail if we have to, pay fines if we have to, but we will not be muted. We will stand for the cause. We will stand for the rights that we have that are no longer being protected. A third comment: our founding fathers, as I said before earlier, not all Christians, but they developed a governing system with checks and balances, okay, established on God's laws and God's principles. And it's why we've been the Great Republic for just about 250 years. We need those checks and balances. Our country never was set up to have a tyrant, who is authoritarian, that runs over the people. That's why we have checks and balances. And then third, as Christians, our primary focus is to win the lost, evangelism, discipleship, training those whom we win over to the faith, training them, and then to be salt and light. Our arena is in the public square. Our arena, unlike the man who wrote to Mr. Murillo, our arena is in the public square. My goodness. We are in the world, but not of the world. And we are to be salt and light. We are to penetrate. We are to illumine. We are to make a difference. And that difference means we get involved in our communities. We get involved in our state. We just don't turn a blind eye to these things. And so, yes, we have a voice. We speak out. We do so with love. We do so with respect. But we also do with conviction, and we stand firm. And so that is my thought about Christians and their responsibility to government. And the topic is of how do Christians relate to civil disobedience. I hope I've been clear. I hope this is clear to you. I hope this is helpful to you. And above all, we stand for Jesus to make a difference in this world. All right? You have a great week, and I'll be looking at you for a Squint podcast next week. Bye.